Welcome back again. Let's try to understand now how a graph can be refracted and translated. If we start with refraction, a graph can only reflect if you happen to have a negative on the part of x. This is the original graph. If you happen to put, or if x is the one which is having a negative, then the graph has to be refracted over the y-axis. It will face in the opposite direction. This is the one which simply means refraction. Because of the presence of this negative, our graph happens to get refracted over the y-axis. Same applies to polynomial function. It happens to have its original function like this. When you happen to put a negative on the part of x, if x is having a negative, then the graph has to be refracted over the y-axis. If you come to translation, a graph can only translate if a negative is outside the function itself. If this is the original function, you'll notice that your graph, of course, has to be translated over the x-axis when you have a negative outside the function. Here is our negative which is outside the function. That's why the graph is translated. The meaning of translation, it simply means the graph has to change its location. If it was facing upwards, it has to face downwards over the x-axis. That's why this graph is facing in that same direction. If your graph had a negative which is facing in this direction due to refraction which occurs between these two, meaning that it will face downwards in that given direction. Refraction only applies to this graph and that type of a graph. Translation applies to this function, which is a root of function. It also applies to absolute function, and finally to quadratic function. For the issue of refraction, the absolute function doesn't have a refraction. It only has a translation and the number of units you can move in the x-axis. This is what we wanted to understand as to what really makes a graph get refracted and get translated. Let's try to have some problems now on how we can try to sketch the same graphs. What steps are you supposed to understand, and when are you supposed to apply each and every step?